Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
The Second World War is over. Self-confident, egotistical colonialist Japan lost. Japan came out of that war with a huge loss, but its growth was not far off. After the war, its GDP per capita was about $96, compared to about $500 before the war. Exactly 50 years later, in 1995, it was $44,197, and Japan had made great progress. By 2024, its GDP per capita is $43,005. Another example is that 15 years after the end of the Second World War, Japan's gross domestic product was $47.42 billion. 35 years later, in 1995, Japan's GDP grew 116.84 times to $5.5 trillion, making it the second largest economy in the world after the United States. Now, looking ahead to 2024, Japan's gross domestic product will be $4.3 trillion. What do both examples have in common? Yes, Japan has been in economic stagnation for years, not growing, not moving forward. In this video, I will tell you about Japan's economic history, what they have done, and why they have risen so high and then not made progress after a certain period. Why Japan's economy cannot be saved. Let's start the video with two words from the famous Japanese economist Kenichi Ome, global village. You will understand what this means better at the end of the video. Yes, Japan today is a country known for its technology brands, its hardworking people, its culture. For the last 30 years, it has been experiencing an economic recession. The salary of a young man working in Japan is almost the same as the salary of his father years ago, because inflation is not at the desired levels in the country. On the contrary, deflation is dominant. Although they have tried to get rid of this situation a little bit in recent years, it has still not been at the desired level. Japan's biggest economic boom before that was in 1868. But after the Second World War, it was as if Japan was back to where it started 15 years ago. Buildings collapsed, people died, factories fell apart. I mean, it was as if life in Japan had come to an end. Japan, known for its industriousness, was gearing up for a second economic boom after the war. After the war, millions of ex-soldiers, young people, women, whoever, joined a well-disciplined and highly educated workforce to rebuild Japan. So much so that when U.S. General Douglas MacArthur was assigned to rebuild Japan, he could hardly believe his eyes. He described Japan this way: "When I got there, everyone from Tokyo on down was working." The phrase, "Japan rising from the ashes," was also popularized during this period. It was precisely that rebirth that allowed Japan to extend its economic influence throughout Asia and beyond. After Japan lost the war, the U.S. invaded the country, and let me put it this way, literally took over Japan. The U.S. made Japan write a new constitution in its favor and limited Japan's capacity for aggression. In the constitution, Japan was forbidden to raise an army and was stripped of its right to declare war. America's main purpose here was to prevent the spread of communist forces in the Asian region and to grow Japan economically to counter the Soviet Union's influence. In 1947, the Zaibatsu system was disbanded under pressure from the United States. The Japanese government decided to switch to the keiretsu system. Here, the Japanese government, especially with the leadership of the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, directed economic growth strategies. In the keiretsu system, the government decided which sectors the money would be invested in, and although the state and private companies were independent, all sectors helped each other to grow the economy. At that time, sectors such as automotive, electronics, and shipbuilding were emphasized. Banks started pumping money into companies. So what kind of policy did the banks follow? Each large group of companies had a parent bank. When companies had a hard time, the parent banks provided financial support to the companies by collecting money and regulating the flow of capital by giving long-term, low-interest loans to these companies. The reason for the breakup of the Zaibatsu system was the breakup of a few large companies that were dominant in Japan, creating a more competitive market. Large companies such as the current Sony and Toyota are the biggest successes of the keiretsu system. At the same time, the country reduced imports, which allowed domestic production to flourish in the domestic market and reach a level where it could compete in world markets. To support the economy, Japan has not only invested in private companies, but has also invested heavily in the education system. These investments prioritized vocational and technical education to improve the quality of the workforce. In order to create a corporate culture among the people, unity was provided to workplaces with the lifetime employment model. This system increased employee loyalty and trust in the company and facilitated long-term planning. In 1948 to 1949, Japan was still working to address the problems of inflation and financial crisis. To prevent this, the U.S. implemented an economic policy called the Dodge Plan, which was characterized by drastic measures. This policy helped to open Japan's economy to foreign trade, stabilize its finances, and reduce the budget deficit. One of these was the pegging of the yen to the U.S. dollar. This peg was as follows. $1 was set equal to 360 Japanese yen. This was a huge step forward for exports. In 1950, the outbreak of the Korean War was a breath of fresh air for Japan. During the war, the U.S. provided logistics and supplies through Japan. This allowed the economy to revive in a way that made a difference. Japanese factories produced vehicles, ammunition, food, and other war materials for the U.S. Army. So this war contributed $3.5 billion to the Japanese economy. Yes, the fact that these things happened, that the U.S. used Japan as a production base, allowed the industrial infrastructure to develop. Can you imagine, on the one hand, a people dying, and on the other hand, a people trying to revive after dying? We have come to the years when Japan was called the economic miracle, where policies were toughened, the economy grew even more, and the world started talking about Japan. One of the biggest architects of this was the people's devotion and love for the country, so much so that Japan even had such a phenomenon, karoshi, meaning death from overwork. People working excessively long hours played an important role in the country's development. The further growth of the economy and exports during these years led to Japan becoming an independent state again in 1952. However, Japan still maintained a close economic and military alliance with the United States. As every sector continued to develop, Japan achieved great momentum in the years 1955 to 1973, averaging 10% economic growth every year. Yes, the era of economic growth has officially begun. It seems that the keiretsu system worked, and in 2024, it is still in active use in Japan. By 1960, Japan was making greater strides in the automotive and technology sectors, introducing itself to the world. Companies like Toyota, Nissan, Panasonic, and Sony became global market leaders. In those years, the government announced the Plan for Doubling Incomes. This was a major economic reform program aimed at increasing prosperity. It was a time when the Toyota Corolla was just becoming a household name. When the Japanese brought the Corolla to the American market, people were very surprised, so much so that a journalist in the U.S. test drove it and was so amazed that he declared, "This car gets almost no gas mileage." After that, Japanese cars attracted a lot of attention in the U.S. market, surpassing America's domestically produced cars. However, in the following years, the U.S. domestic production automotive sectors made great objections to this issue. After it was decided to hold the Olympics in Japan, the first bullet train, the Shinkansen, was launched in 1964. Now, we all know how strong the work ethic of the Japanese people is. Let me tell you a story. These bullet trains had to be ready for use by the start of the Tokyo Olympics. Hideo Shima, the engineer who guided the project, worked day and night to complete the project and was dedicated to it, as if it was a matter of life and death. He is even said to have told his family that if the project failed, "I will resign so as not to embarrass us." The Shinkansen was completed on time and became Japan's gateway to the world. Years have passed and a balloon is slowly inflating. You may remember the Bretton Woods Agreement that the U.S. made in 1944. This agreement established the U.S. dollar as the key reserve currency backed by gold. Other currencies were linked to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. One of these currencies was the Japanese yen. However, as the U.S. ran a trade deficit over the years, falling behind Germany and Japan, and as the dollar increased and gold reserves became insufficient, the U.S. exited the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1971. As a consequence, the yen appreciated. While this was good for Japan's domestic market, it was not good for exporting companies. Why? Because as the value of the yen rose, demand for Japanese brands in global markets declined. These were the first steps in the slowdown of the economy. 2 years later, the world oil crisis increased the price of oil by 300%. Japan took a different path and emphasized more innovative technology. Japan was able to work efficiently compared to other countries. Rumor has it that a Japanese engineering team lived in the factory almost 24 hours a day while working on energy-efficient engines, saying, "We owe it to future generations." Entering the 1980s, Japan faced a mild economic recession, but this did not last long. After 6 years, Japan entered a period of great economic expansion. Japan invested heavily in the lagging steel and construction sectors, which led to huge improvements in wages and employment. This expansion coincided with the period 1986 to 1992. After 1992, there was a recession, with GDP growth of only 1.7%. The automotive and technology sectors also suffered. Japan was slowing down and losing ground in the US and other markets. Until 1980, Japan earned most of its profits from exports, but in the late 1980s, Japan's economy became more based on domestic demand than exports. As the value of the yen increased, people started to spend more, and companies invested more accordingly. Low interest rates and the constant pumping of money into the country made people richer. In fact, this myth is always talked about. One of the biggest real estate bubbles in Japan was in the Shinjuku neighborhood in Tokyo. In the late 1980s, real estate prices in this area reached astronomical levels. For example, in 1989, the land of Tokyo's most famous hotel building, the Tokyo Imperial Hotel, was sold for $36.6 billion. At that time, Japan's real estate market was worth more than the entire American real estate market. Tokyo has become one of the world's largest financial centers, but the recession has taken its toll in this area as well. The year 1985 was a turning point for Japan's economy. Nothing was the same after that. The US saw that Japan was going downhill. The automotive and technology companies in the country also had big complaints. Finally, the 5 major economic powers, the US, Japan, West Germany, France, and the UK, came together and achieved the Plaza Accord in the US. As a result of this agreement, the yen began to appreciate rapidly, from 240 yen dollar in 1985 to 120 yen dollar by 1987. The prices of Japanese goods in foreign trade increased and interest in them began to wane. One of the biggest factors in the growth of this economy has been policies to encourage the Japanese people to save. Money in banks increased, companies invested more. As the yen appreciated, Japanese products became more affordable, creating trade deficits, and this trade expanded day by day. But with banks pumping money into the market, with more money around, of course there was some speculation. Japan went into an asset bubble. By 1989, the Tokyo Stock Exchange peaked with the Nikkei index reaching 38,957 points. Real estate prices reached jaw-dropping levels. Luxury properties in Ginza were fetching more than 1.5 million US dollars per square meter. But as the bubble inflated, it became harder to hold on to it. As the 1990s began, the collapse of the stock and real estate markets wiped out trillions of dollars, deeply shaking the Japanese economy. The boom, the bubble burst. Everything went into decline. Everything that had been built up over the years slowly began to diminish. People took out huge loans and invested in properties that suddenly became unaffordable. Think about it. You go into debt and buy a house, then the price of that house falls and all you have left is debt. Affected by this situation, people tightened their belts. Consumption went down. People started to spend less. This put the Japanese economy into recession, which is still going on. For years, banks continued to make risky loans, but as they made loans that were unlikely to be repaid, events like zombie businesses became the norm. This predicament became known in the Japanese economy as the lost decade. The Nikkei 225 index bottomed out at 7,603 points in April 2003. Although there was some recovery after that, its value still began to fall. This is still the case in Japan. Yes, Japan's huge corporations still have a very high market share in foreign trade. Thanks to the policies of the past, the work done, the unity and beliefs of the people, Japan is still the 3rd largest economic power in the world, behind the US and China, but it is not as glorious as it used to be. Even though the government has made many changes and pursued different policies, it has not been able to reach the desired levels of inflation. On the contrary, it has been struggling with deflation for years. Japan's economy is like this. If you put people in expectation, everyone waits for the end. So if you talk about inflation in a country day by day, for example, Turkey is an example, then people expect it. This is the case in Japan. People are used to it. People are used to it now. Everyone is thinking, let me keep this money now. The price will come down as time goes on. I will buy it then. Spending has decreased, and no matter how much the banks lower interest rates, they fail to encourage people to spend money. More precisely, they cannot provide the rates they want. Accordingly, inflation rates cannot reach the desired levels. This is not the only reason. The population is very old. The elderly make up 30% of the population. The birth rate is 1.3 per woman. Normally, for a country's population to remain stable, the fertility rate should be 2.1. Anything below that and the population starts to decline. Yes, it varies from country to country, but in Japan it is very low. This leads to labor shortages in the long run. In other countries, immigration policies are put in place to counter this situation, but Japan's culture is not used to this. The fact that the country has been closed to the outside world for years, living their lives as if they live in another world, makes the situation even more difficult. The next reason is that Japan's debt is now about 260% of its GDP. To put that in perspective, in the US, it is around 120%. So Japan's debt is more than twice the size of its economy. The business world is also too hierarchical and closed to innovation. There is not much space for young entrepreneurs, and the system is dominated by big companies. This limits creativity and economic dynamism. More precisely, if you want to start a startup in Japan, it seems like you may need the consent of your grandparents. Yes, Japan is like this for now. The government is doing its best, but this is the result. You have to learn from these things, because no matter how big you are, wrong decisions have unintended consequences. So what do you think? This is the first video of my channel, and if you want to support me, you can like and subscribe to the video. One last question. What have the British ever done in the economy?